Welcome back. Your bills, your bank accounts likely already reflect this. The official numbers this week confirm it. As we told you earlier this week, Canada's inflation rate, or the rate of price increases, hit a 3-decade high in December, currently sitting at 4.8%. Economists do expect the Bank of Canada to raise interest rates next week, we shall see, in an attempt to help cool inflation. So what levers can the federal government pull? What should it be doing? 3 of your members of parliament are here with their take. Rachel Bendayen is the Parliamentary Secretary for the Associate Minister of Finance. Pierre Poilievre is the Conservative Finance Critic. And Daniel Blaikie is the NDP Finance Critic. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being on the show.
Hi, my pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Ms. Bendayen, I'll start with you. Economists expect the Bank of Canada to raise interest rates next week. Do you think that should be a signal to your government to dial back the deficit spending the government has rolled out and is still proposing?
Well, I think the Bank of Canada is responsible for monetary policy, but I also think that we need to remind ourselves that we are still very much in the pandemic. I mean, I just took a walk down my main street, as I do every day, talking to restaurant owners, talking to businesses, and there are many lockdown measures still in effect in many provinces. Here in Quebec, our cafes, bars, and restaurants are closed, and many workers are still taking home $0. So I'm happy to talk about inflation. I'm happy to attack what we are seeing as a global problem in affecting countries around the world. But we also need to make sure that people are taking home a salary. Talking to a woman who cleans hotel rooms who's not bringing home a single dollar these days means that our government does need to continue to have their backs. It does need to continue to provide those wage supports, provide the supports for workers who are sick and need to stay home from work. I think that the most important economic policy is a strong health policy.
The PBO also, in its report released this week, says that the rationale for more stimulus spending does not exist based on your own government's benchmarks around employment numbers specifically. So why keep spending? And if you do, is that not going to add to the inflation problem?
Well, I believe the PBO wrote that report at the beginning of December, and the world has changed in 100 different ways since then. We are now in the middle of the Omicron wave. We're doing quite well, if you will recall, in November and in December, many provinces shut down many parts of their economies. We are still in that phase. And so I think we need to be mindful of the fact that Canadians need our support. The reality is that cities and provinces are not able to provide that support, and that leaves us. And I think as the federal government, we are expected to have Canadians' backs, and I will not apologize for spending in order to make sure that Canadians can pay their rent and put food on their table.
Mr. Poilievre, I know you're waiting to get in on this one. Is that a fair assessment? Inflation is affecting countries right around the world, certainly not just Canada. But what's your response to what you just heard?
Well, the inflation we're experiencing here in Canada is all for things that we make right here, not things that we import from the rest of the world. For example, real estate. Of course, land does not come from the rest of the world. It's not imported. It's not transported here on a ship. And yet land prices are up 20%. House prices are up 26% year over year. The typical home, according to the Real Estate Association, now costs $811,000. That's up from $430,000 when Trudeau took office. Prices have nearly doubled since he became the prime minister. We have the second most inflated housing bubble on earth, according to Bloomberg. Vancouver and Toronto are the second and fifth most unaffordable housing markets in the world, according to Demographia. And all of the recent house price inflation has followed on the government printing about $400 billion of new cash, flooding it into financial and mortgage markets in order to keep its own borrowing costs low. But that money has overflowed into the housing market and caused this enormous bubble that could burst at any time. We learned today in the Finance Committee that 1/2 of all new mortgages in the last year are variable rate, meaning that the bills will start going up for these families as soon as rates rise. And Ms. Bendayen and the Liberal solution is to keep spending and driving up interest rates and inflation. The more the government borrows and spends, the more it inflates the economy, the more it pushes up interest rates.
Let me bring in Mr. Blaikie, who's been waiting patiently. And on that issue, your party has in fact criticized the Liberals for cutting back on some pandemic supports. But again, as we said, the PBO report says the rationale for spending is no longer there due to recovering employment numbers. Should we be adding more spending to already historically high national debt?
Well, the question is, what help is available for Canadians when they really need it? And with the Omicron variant, we've seen a significant increase in the amount of Canadians that either aren't working at all because they've been laid off, or the business at which they work has been shut down, or Canadians who just aren't able to get enough hours. So they may still be employed, but they're not getting anywhere near enough hours to support themselves. So the question is, well, what happens to those folks? I mean, we heard also today a committee from the head of the CMHC that part of what helped avoid a lot of defaults in the mortgage industry during the pandemic was that $500 a week CERB benefit. Of course, the Liberals have cut that by 40% down to $300 a week, and they've made it much more difficult to access the benefits. They've done away with CERB altogether and replaced it with the CWLB, which has different rules. And we're hearing from a lot of Canadians who are having trouble access that benefit. So there is absolutely a need to continue to support Canadians directly with financial support who aren't able to pay their rent and to put food on the table. Angus Reid published a poll today that says about 60% of Canadian families are saying that they are worried about and have doubts about their ability to properly feed their family. And so there is absolutely a continuing need for support. I think, the question is, do we need to spend money just for the sake of stimulating the economy? No, but we do have to make sure that Canadians can continue to be housed and fed. And we have to meet challenges like the climate crisis, which is going to involve investment. And to the extent that part of the dramatic increase in housing costs has to do with a lack of supply, particularly for social housing.
Ms. Bendayen, lots to respond to there, but if we could focus on the issue of housing, we're seeing these soaring prices. People that can't even find a place to rent that is affordable. What more needs to be done, and what can your government do?
Well, we want to attack this issue from both the supply side and the demand side. So we've already exceeded our targets in the Rapid Housing Initiative. There are over 10,000 units that are already built, and we are absolutely committed to continuing to build more units, affordable housing for all Canadians. But I think we also need to attack the speculation that we're seeing in the market right now. And we put forward a proposal to tax foreign buyers that are coming from the outside to scoop up Canadian houses that should be here for Canadians. I was surprised and certainly disappointed to see the Conservatives vote against it. It certainly seems like something that we should all be looking at. We were elected to represent Canadians. I wonder what foreign buyers are in the pockets of Mr. Poilievre or his Conservative colleagues that he is so adamantly against a tax on foreign buyers.
Well, let's let Mr. Poilievre respond to that. Your party, Mr. Poilievre, promised in the past to build 1 million homes in 3 years. How would you plan to do that wouldn't require spending that you've criticized the Liberals for?
Well, the opposite of spending is necessary. We could sell off 15% of the 37,000 federal buildings and make that a space available for affordable housing, given that more and more public servants are working from home and our office space was underutilized before the pandemic. That would be the opposite of spending, because it would actually raise money for the government to reduce its deficit, sell the assets at a time when the market's at its peak, and free up housing supply. We also believe that our infrastructure transfers to municipalities should have conditions that they more quickly approve housing building permits, particularly close to transit stations, so that low-income and young people can live without a car near transit, and that we can remove the number one extra cost that is associated with building housing, which is governmental red tape.
Mr. Blaikie, last word to you on this. What would you like to see the government do to address the housing crisis across this country?
Well, there's no question that it is going to take government intervention. If the free market was going to solve the housing crisis in Canada, then it would have done so by now, because this isn't a new problem. And in fact, it's a problem that's been worsening over the 25 years since the Liberals canceled the original national housing strategy in the mid-90s. So there definitely is a role for government leadership. There's a role for federal government leadership. And part of that means trying to reinstate the kind of system that we had prior to the mid-90s, where there was regular annual funding that became available, including some funding to support nonprofits and cooperatives in developing proposals for building new non-market housing, but with the regularity and predictability that when land becomes available, they could go ahead and acquire land, because they could expect that if it took 2 or 3 years for them to develop the plan for building the actual housing on that land, that money was coming. And the problem is that, first of all, for 20 years, the federal government just wasn't showing up at all. And now they're doing it on an ad hoc announcement basis. And nonprofits and cooperatives can't chase projects. They have to be proactive and they have to be prudent. And that means knowing that there's regular, reliable funding streams available each year.
We will have to leave it there. I think it's safe to say Canadians, whoever is in charge of the federal government, want something done. They want action and help. So I thank you all for your time. Rachel Bendayen, Pierre Poilievre, and Daniel Blaikie, thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.